Welcome to Eye to Market, a web series designed to help you explore and navigate the successful path to market for your ophthalmic innovation.
Welcome to Eye to Market. I'm your host, Brian Kenyon. In today's episode, we're going to talk about what are the questions my investors are really going to want to know in order to invest in my product. So from your perspective as an investor, what are you looking for to analyze? Are we trying to solve a real clinical problem or just make something to make money?
It's a great and very important fundamental question, Brian. I think for any entrepreneur, it's, is this going to really be a worthwhile innovation? Because we know how many years and how many dollars, it could be five to 15 years and, 50 to hundreds of millions of dollars to develop this. So the first step is, what's the unmet need? What's out there? You don't want to have really a better mousetrap. You need something that is really going to serve an unmet need. Our bias at Interwest is to look for disruptive innovation that are really, moonshot sort of things, but it could be an incremental, better IOL. The bigger the unmet need, the better, but it could be more incremental than disruptive. But our experience has been the highest returns are actually in the disruptive innovations. So that's looking for a big unmet need. And then there's a lot of debate about how do you determine that unmet need. That's not as straightforward as it seems. You can't always ask the customer what their unmet need is. You really have to do some visionary thought about what is not being served. And oftentimes the customer may not even know that. None of us knew that we needed iPhones when we all had flip phones. I was disappointed when I lost my flip phone. But Steve Jobs was brilliant. He saw what the unmet need was and what the potential was. So I think that kind of thinking and trying to really be visionary about things, even unmet needs that are in white spaces might be in completely new areas. For instance, right now we have robotics that are really starting to come into ophthalmology, and that's a space that can't be analyzed. It's an unmet need to have better, faster, more precise surgery. But it's not an analytic market where you could say, oh, there's a gap in the market there. It's actually a wholly new market that we're developing.
So how do you then take that idea and analyze the market to understand what's the market size and who will truly benefit from that innovation?
Yeah, so this is an exercise that is more analytical. And I think that even with the disruptive innovations, you might do a little thought experiment and say, well, if it could do X, Y, Z, what could the market be for that? And then you're talking about really the total available market, the TAM for it. You want that to be something that's billions of dollars. I think for a big innovation, it's going to require a lot of capital. You need it to be a big market, at least. I'm talking from a venture capital standpoint, but I think even for strategics or other people, find a big market. And then the question is, what percent of that market can you get over time and how long will it take you? And that's really what is the make or break for most companies. A lot of companies address very large markets, but they aren't able to penetrate them. So I think a very important part of the market analysis is what is the go-to-market strategy and what's realistic for how quickly you could develop a revenue stream from that market. And that's the so-called hockey stick of when revenue is going up. And that's probably the diciest part of startups is how you get on that hockey stick ramp. And often it's easy to be overly optimistic. So I always like the companies that are the most thoughtful and see what all the speed bumps are along the way to developing the market that they identify.
So we're always thinking about market size. How many people suffer from this? How many people could I potentially impact and help? How does that factor into your analysis when we're looking at these products and we're thinking about how do I present this to my investors? How important is the market size to those investors?
The big numbers are really exciting to investors, especially to an investor that maybe isn't super savvy within ophthalmology or super experienced in ophthalmology. Certainly some of the products that are entering into a market that already exists, what the penetration is into that market. So if you look at something like myopia, for example, huge population that we're looking at. But if we start to look at progressive myopia, and we're trying to address progressive myopia, what you're really looking at are those younger myopic patients. So that's a different cut there. So really starting to look at what the specific audience is that you're looking at and all of the different ways you can look at that number. And I think when it comes to investors, what I tend to see is that the folks who really understand not just the big number, but understand all of the layers to that of what may exist, complications that are there, but also additional opportunity. Because some of these products that we're seeing really can expand access to care. And so when that's the case, that total addressable market that is there right now can actually get bigger.
Yeah.
There's a lot of kind of interesting aspects to this. And I wish it was a little bit more straightforward and clean cut.
What advice would you give them about what's going to be that pivotal information that's most important to investors?
Yeah, so certainly I think the big number is obviously important. We want to know that there is patients out there that need to be treated. We want to look at whether or not this is a one-time treatment or one-time surgery, perhaps like an IOL, or if this is an ongoing treatment that they're going to be doing. Those things matter. But then also looking at any kind of devices or pharmaceuticals that exist today that are on the market, what their adoption is. So if we're looking at, let's say, IVTs, how many doctors are actually doing IVTs today? Even if you don't have a therapy that is directly competing in that space, it's such a good marker to show adoption and uptick in something. And it also gives you an idea of what is actually being done, a realistic view of where the market sits today for something that's comparable. And that doesn't always exist, to be fair, right? If we have something that's truly novel, that may not exist. But there are lots of really interesting technologies that there can be some correlations that are there. So I think that's really important. And something that I've seen on some slides today, actually, that I really enjoy seeing is what that road looks like for the next 6 months, the next 6 years, even in some cases. You know, what the milestones are, where they're planned, where you are today, and a very realistic roadmap for where you want to go and what it's going to take to get there, I think is really just having a clear view of what's going to happen. In your ideal world, at least.
I'm a big fan of knowing your market and getting data. The more that you can get that's specific to your product, the better. So there's groups like MarketScope, there's groups like IQVIA. There's a number of different organizations that have published reports that will give you that broad spectrum. But if you can afford it, and I think it's one of those investments that will pay dividends, having an actual custom report done for you that asks the market, what is your willingness to adopt? What are you doing today? And then presents them with sort of a target product profile that explains, you know, what is your product aiming to achieve, and getting real feedback from your end customer about how excited are they for it will give you so much information to, you know, help sell your product to investors, demonstrate that interest, as well as maybe uncover things that you didn't think were going to be a problem. Maybe they are. So you'd want to know that early on. So that's my take.
And I think when you think about market research, you're thinking not only about the physicians, but patients. If you're able to do research in both segments, it would definitely pay dividends because you're really trying to carve out that right message for each of those audiences. And there's nothing more valuable than getting that information from the patient saying, yes, I would be willing to pay for this and I'd be willing to pay this much. And these benefits would be super important to me. And then tying that message and that research back into what physicians are saying, then you have something really strong to present.
You don't have to put a lot of money in to get really valuable information, even early on. So, you know, sometimes you'll get a quote for a report that is really expensive. Maybe do something that's shorter. Maybe it's a smaller end value that just gives you like a trend for direction. Directionality is really all you're looking for at this point because you've got, again, more time down the road as you get more resources in to do something deeper and richer. But at least any directional information that speaks to your product can be helpful.
Seeing what others have done, the pearls and pitfalls, the learnings, and how you're going to be able to address those with your product or do something in such a way that you've learned from them and you're going to evolve over time is excellent. And then you can tie that message into what and how you present your own products.
What some of our innovators can do in those earlier stages to build a better business case where they would attract capital earlier in the cycle versus later in the cycle. And is it even possible?
It's tough. That's been a big sea change we've seen in investing, not just in ophthalmology, but also just broadly in life sciences. And the reason for that is because the exits are trending later and later. And the IPO market has been closed since about 2021, 2022. Everyone's realizing you have to go a bit longer. And that's causing venture funds to phase a bit later because we're thinking about, okay, when we put our money in, how long is it until we're going to be able to get this return? If that starts stretching out a bit too long, it starts impacting our returns and the people we report to. We have our limited partners that we have a fiduciary responsibility to, and so we're trying to be good stewards of that capital that they've entrusted us with to make sure we get it back to them in a timely manner. So that's what's been shifting VC later. But there are funds that do that earlier investing, that take that earlier risk, and so you always have to think about where you are in your cycle and what venture funds would fit one, your business model, but two, kind of what round you're raising, the size round, and where that's going to get you. So kind of earlier on, if you're looking at generating preclinical data, usually say friends and family rounds are great for that. And that really means just individual investors that really believe in your story, that get capital from them that can help push you forward. Also non-dilutive capital, such as grants, are, I think, really, really important to this ecosystem to help with those earlier stages. And then I think the most challenging round to raise is on the pharma side for all your I&D work.
Okay.
Because that just gets you your kind of tox work, you're getting your manufacturing down, to get the regulatory say, yep, this is good, now you can run your clinical study.
We talked a little bit about getting the appropriate data early in the process. How do we attract investors earlier on? What are the key things that you might be looking for in that early data? Typically it's just about safety, but more and more we're seeing clinical trials that are designed to get some of that efficacy and subjective data in there as well. What are some of the things that you're looking for in that early data?
Safety is super important. Like
Number
that's the primary endpoint,
Yep.
but we really like to see these exploratory endpoints where it's looking at, are there hints of this working? Is there a reason to believe? Is it working as a mechanism of action would theorize? And so if we're starting to see those hints, that can be really good because it can give us kind of the confidence to put more capital behind these opportunities. Any way you can think about it, maybe some of these endpoints can be longer before they would show up. Maybe it's a 2-3 year endpoint for glaucoma, looking at field of view loss. That can take a really long time for that to show up. So we are open to other endpoints, other biomarkers, structural endpoints that maybe would give you a hint that you'll have that functional endpoint if you're able to run the study longer. Or maybe it's, you have 6-12 month safety endpoint, and then maybe you have some follow-up endpoints longer out for patients that are willing to come back. It's quite a journey to go down this road of starting a business and finding that path. It's going to take years and a lot of perseverance. And I think something we kind of look for from the very beginning is the team. The team is really important. It's not just you, the founder, but the people you surround yourself with. And that can be third-party vendors, consultants, but also employees and the medical advisory board that you build. And all that is really key because this is a complex venture that you're going down and no one has all the answers. So I think that team is critically important, and all the business partners too along the way that you bring along for the ride.
What are investors looking to know from me to know and have the confidence that I'm ready for that next stage?
The translatability of preclinical to clinical sometimes is not very good. And unfortunately in ophthalmology, we've seen that time and time again. So you can't wholly rely on the preclinical data, efficacy data. However, if your clinical development plan is very well thought out and you involve individuals that have done this before, right, and have experience, that adds a lot of credibility. So I think having the right team, and if you're a very small startup, then that's where it makes sense to partner with a CRO or a consultant or someone that's been down this path before. Be very aware of the clinical regulatory requirements. So what is the FDA looking for? What is allowed? Even questions like your clinical development plan in that first study, is it going to address what the FDA is interested in? But what about the European regulatory authorities? What about PMDA? What about CFDA? So a lot of these investors and or strategics are interested in global products. So when we design trials and think that through, you have to really make sure it's harmonized, that program, for multiple regions, if that's your ultimate goal. But just having a very well thought out plan, and even if you're not a clinical expert, have folks like those in the room to help you or to consult, help set you up for success. But I think just having the right answers and knowing the plan goes a long way.
Given your extensive experience, multiple players within the industry, and your senior level, I'm sure you've been involved in looking at products and deciding, is this something we want to pursue, right, as an organization? Looking at it from that perspective, from that strategic positioning, right, as a large partner in the industry, what are the things you're looking for as an investor to say, that's something we want to pursue?
So as I started earlier explaining kind of what's put into a business plan, I think then if you turn it around and look at what the person who's evaluating the business plan is going to want. Is they want all of that information, but then taking it a step further, and we didn't go through the rest of the business planning, is there a differentiation in the technology or the product? Is there protection around it? Is there a regulatory pathway that's realistic? And then is there an economic model that's going to make this work? So I think that's what has to be documented, and that's what is going to be evaluated. And then there are the intangibles, the people involved. How are you going to manage? How are you going to build your team? How are you going to adapt to challenges? Because there are always going to be changes and challenges that will come up. And so that comes from developing relationships and having trust on both sides. So I think those are all some of the things. There are more, but those are some of the key elements I can think of. So let's maybe start from that beginning phase. Attaining this technology or product has an initial cost, and maybe there's an ongoing licensing fee, royalty. So all of that has to be factored in. Then there is certainly the cost of developing the next phase or the product that can actually eventually come to market. So if it's an engineering product or a digital product, there's significant software costs, et cetera, hardware and software, and additional costs beyond that. If it's a pharmaceutical product, then you're going to have to figure out how you are going to manufacture this in a way that you can put into clinical trials, but then eventually even commercialize. So all of those high-level costs need to be figured out. And then there's the clinical trial costs, depending on the regulatory pathway, to actually, again, bring it to market. And usually, the financing for each of these things would be done in phases and, tranches or, different series as you go along with different milestones. But then there's also the cost of, again, the people, whether it's external consultants, as we talked about with IP, but legal, all the other areas of assistance that are needed in any startup organization. And then there's the internal people. So I think if you kind of put it in those buckets, you at least get the major areas. But then there's also always unanticipated costs.
There's the unknowns, right? Yeah, that happens with every project. I can speak from my house alone.